The beep was loud enough to slice through the silence. Declined. The sound came sharp and metallic, a sterile echo in the small supermarket on the corner of Maple and Fifth. For a second, even the humming refrigerators seemed to pause. Ethan Cole held the card reader in his hand as though the plastic rectangle might suddenly change its mind. His jaw tightened, his shoulders drawn up stiff under the worn blazer he still wore out of habit, even though its lining had frayed and the button at the cuff hung by a thread. The cashier shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the growing line behind him. "I'm sorry, sir," she said in a voice that tried to be gentle but landed flat. "It's been declined." The word carried more weight than the beep. Declined. Not just the transaction, but his whole life. His career, his reputation, his place in the world. Declined. Ethan swallowed hard, as if he could push down the shame rising in his chest, but the heat crept up his neck anyway. Someone 2 customers back muttered just loud enough, "Man in a suit can't even pay for groceries." A quick chuckle followed. Another voice added, "Must have left his millions in New York." The laughter wasn't cruel in tone, but it cut all the same, because it assumed everything about him without knowing a thing. Ethan wanted to explain, to say that once he had never needed to think about the cost of cereal or bread, that once he had signed checks that shifted markets, that he had sat at tables where billion-dollar deals were made. But none of that mattered here. Not with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, not with the stares pressing down on him like a weight. To the people in line, he was just another middle-aged man pretending he belonged in a suit he couldn't afford. He slid the card back into his wallet slowly, buying himself a few seconds. His eyes caught the reflection of himself in the security mirror above the checkout. The streaks of gray in his hair looked harsher under the store's lighting. His eyes seemed older than he remembered, like they had carried too many nights without sleep. Do you want me to try again?" the cashier asked, though her hand already hovered over the cancel button. Ethan's throat went dry. His pride screamed to walk out, to abandon the bag of groceries on the belt and retreat before anyone recognized him. But his body didn't move. Hunger weighed heavier than dignity now. And then, from somewhere below the counter's edge, a small hand appeared. It placed 3 crumpled dollar bills and a few coins on the conveyor belt. Ethan blinked, startled. He turned, and there she was. A little girl, no older than 8, wearing a pink jacket with a missing button and shoes that had seen better years. Her hair was tied in a lopsided braid. She looked up at him with eyes so steady, so disarmingly sure, that he felt a pang in his chest. "It's okay," she said softly, her voice carrying more strength than her small frame suggested. "You can use mine." The coins clinked against the plastic as she pushed them closer. The line behind Ethan shifted, murmurs rising. Some chuckled, others scoffed, but the girl's face remained earnest. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't mocking. She was simply offering. Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. He could only stare at her, stunned into silence. A woman hurried up then, dark hair pulled back, scrubs still wrinkled from a long shift. "Sophie," she whispered urgently, placing a hand on the girl's shoulder. "What are you doing?" The girl glanced at her mother, then back at Ethan. "He needed help, Mom." The mother sighed, her face etched with both exhaustion and quiet grace. She looked at Ethan then, and for a moment their eyes locked. Hers were cautious, protective. His were raw, stripped of the armor he once wore in boardrooms. He cleared his throat. I can't take your money," he said finally, his voice rough. But the girl, Sophie, only tilted her head as if he were speaking nonsense. "Dad always said if someone's standing alone, you stand next to them." The sentence struck Ethan like a forgotten melody. Simple, unpolished, but resonant. He swallowed hard again, but this time it wasn't shame tightening his throat. It was something else, something he hadn't felt in years. The cashier, perhaps sensing the moment, quietly swiped through the little girl's offering. The register beeped again, but softer this time, like an echo of grace. Approved. The bag of groceries slid toward Ethan. He picked it up slowly, his hands trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from something heavier, humility. Thank you, he said, but the words felt too small. They couldn't hold the weight of what had just happened. Sophie smiled, a gap where one front tooth should have been. It's just groceries, she said, as if that explained everything. Her mother gave Ethan a polite nod, then guided her daughter away. Yet Sophie kept glancing back, as though to make sure the stranger was all right. Ethan stepped out of the supermarket with his bag pressed against his chest. The air outside was crisp, the mountain wind of Asheville curling around him. He walked slowly down the street, each step echoing with the memory of that little voice. If someone's standing alone, you stand next to them. For years he had stood alone, surrounded by wealth, accolades, and headlines, yet lonelier than he dared admit. And now, in the most humiliating moment of his life, an 8-year-old had reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that dignity wasn't in what you kept, but in what you gave. The bag of bread and milk felt heavier than it should. Or maybe it wasn't the groceries at all. Maybe it was the thought that somewhere between the rubble of his failures and the shadows of his disgrace, a spark had flickered. Not redemption, not yet. But something rarer. Possibility. He turned the corner toward his empty apartment, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole allowed himself to whisper a fragile thought he hadn't dared touch. Maybe this isn't the end. Rachel and Sophie walked beside Ethan as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The night air of Asheville was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. Sophie hopped along the sidewalk, swinging her small arms. We live close, she said brightly, on Maple Street. You can come for soup. Rachel gave her daughter a look, half apology, half warning. She talks too much, she said softly. Not at all, Ethan answered, though his voice felt rusty. The building they entered was worn but steady, brick darkened by years of weather. Inside, the stairwell was narrow, each step groaning with memory. On the second floor, Sophie pressed her palm to a faded wooden door. Home. When Rachel turned the key, warmth spilled out. The apartment was small, a couch mended with careful stitches, a coffee table that had once been a crate, walls decorated with Sophie's drawings taped in uneven lines. Ethan's eyes landed on a photograph on the fridge, a man in a baseball cap, his arm wrapped around Rachel, holding a toddler Sophie on his hip. That's Tom, Sophie explained. My dad. He's with the Stars now. Rachel's face didn't move, though her hands tightened on the grocery bag. Car accident. 2 years ago. I'm sorry, Ethan said quietly. She nodded once, then began setting the table. Soup's still warm. They ate at a small kitchen table. The broth smelled of garlic and thyme, richer than anything Ethan had tasted in years. Sophie dunked her bread clumsily, grinning at the soggy mess. Rachel watched her daughter with quiet focus, making sure each spoonful reached her lips. Ethan lifted his own spoon, and memories stirred. Nights of canned soup in a dim kitchen, his mother stretching meals until payday, his father sanding splinters from a doorframe. He had run from that smallness all the way to Wall Street. Yet here, with steam fogging the window and a child humming as she ate, he felt something that boardrooms had never given him, the sense that the world could still be whole. How long have you been in Asheville? Rachel asked. A few weeks, Ethan replied. I wanted a place where no one knew me. Quiet is different from alone, Sophie said, her eyes clear. The words struck deeper than she could know. Ethan managed a faint smile. You're right. After dinner, Ethan tried to place money on the table. For the groceries, he said. I can't take a child's offering. Sophie shook her head firmly. It's not about money. Dad always said, if someone's standing alone, you stand next to them. That's the rule. She disappeared into her room and returned with a notebook. After scribbling quickly, she tore out a page and held it up proudly. A drawing of a tall stick figure surrounded by small hands. Above it, the words, stand next to. For your pocket, she said. Ethan stared at the shaky lines until his vision blurred. He had once collected art worth more than this apartment, but none of it had ever pierced him like this scrap of paper. Slowly, he folded it and slid it into his jacket. Thank you, he whispered. Later, as Rachel prepared for her night shift, Ethan washed dishes at the sink while Sophie stacked plates into teetering towers. The small routine felt strangely sacred. Work, not as punishment or ambition, but as care. When it was time to leave, Sophie pressed an envelope into his hand. In careful pencil, she had written Mr. Ethan. Inside was the drawing. So you don't forget, she said. He stepped out into the night, the envelope against his chest. At the corner, he turned back. Through the window, he saw a rectangle of light, Rachel rinsing bowls, Sophie coloring at the table. A quiet glow, steady, unpretentious. His own apartment waited cold and empty. But as he walked toward it, Ethan felt that something had shifted. Quiet, he realized, no longer had to mean alone. The video was barely 30 seconds long, a grainy clip from someone's phone in the supermarket line. Ethan Cole, standing in his faded blazer, card declined again and again. The pause, the shuffle of feet. The laughter caught in the background. And then the little girl's hand, Sophie's hand, pushing a pile of coins onto the counter. The caption made it worse. Billionaire goes broke, rescued by 8-year-old. By the time Ethan woke, the video had been shared across local forums, then regional news sites, then social media feeds with millions of eyes. Comments poured in like acid rain. Wall Street vampire needs allowance now. He ruined lives and now eats on kids' lunch money. Typical. Rich men fall and expect sympathy. The cruelest sting wasn't that strangers mocked him. He was used to that. Years ago, after the collapse, his name had been shredded across every headline. But this time, his disgrace had a child's face in it. Her gap-toothed smile frozen in pixels, the innocence of her offering twisted into punchlines. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, head in his hands, the glow of his cracked laptop burning the insults into his eyes. He thought of Maple Street, of the soup steam curling from bowls, of Rachel's watchful silence. Would they see this? Would Rachel regret opening her door? Sophie regret opening her hand? His phone buzzed. A message from a number he didn't know. A journalist request for comment. Then another, then another. He powered it off. But he couldn't power off the voices in his head. You're nothing. You lost everything. You dragged an innocent child into your shame. There was a knock at the door. He froze, expecting reporters. But when he opened it, Sophie stood there, holding a paper bag. Rachel lingered at the bottom of the stairwell, arms folded. Mom said you might forget to eat, Sophie chirped. So we brought muffins. They're from the hospital cafeteria. Not great, but better than nothing. He stepped aside. Sophie marched in, placing the bag on his counter as if she had done this 100 times. Why are you sad? She asked, eyes narrowing. He forced a smile. Just tired. She tilted her head. Mom says tired means you worked too hard. But you didn't. You just had a hiccup. He frowned. A what? A hiccup, she repeated, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. You know, your chest goes hic and then it stops. What happened at the store was like that. Not forever, just a hiccup. The word fell into him like a stone into still water, rippling outward. He looked at her, this child who had unwittingly become part of his public shame, and saw not pity, but certainty. To her, he wasn't ruined. He wasn't a headline. He was a man who had stumbled. Nothing more. Rachel stepped into the apartment then, her eyes sharp with questions. "The video," she said. "It's everywhere." "I know." His voice cracked. "I'm sorry, I never wanted—" She shook her head. "Don't apologize to me. People will say what they want. My worry is Sophie. Kids can be cruel." "I can handle it," Sophie said firmly, puffing out her chest. "Dad said if people laugh, you laugh louder. Because laughter's just sound, not truth." Rachel exhaled, half exasperation, half awe. She remembers everything he ever said. Ethan sat down heavily. "I don't know how to fix this." Rachel studied him. "Maybe you don't. Maybe you live past it instead." For hours after they left, Ethan replayed Sophie's words. Hiccup. A small interruption. Temporary. Survivable. That night, unable to sleep, he searched his own name online again. The video had spawned memes, jokes, commentary, but buried in the avalanche, he found one comment that stopped him. It wasn't long. Just a username, Old Man Jenkins, and the words, "The girl was right to stand next to him. Sometimes that matters more than money." Ethan leaned back in his chair, tears stinging. Among the noise, one voice had chosen to see what really happened. He folded Sophie's drawing, "Stand next to," and placed it beside his bed. As the city's laughter roared outside his walls, he closed his eyes, holding on to the smallest truth. Not all the world was against him. At least one child still believed. And for now, that was enough to make him breathe again. The playground sat behind a row of boarded-up shops on the east side of town, where weeds had grown taller than benches and rust chewed the edges of the slide. Ethan had stumbled upon it one evening while walking home from Maple Street. The chain-link fence leaned like tired shoulders, and the paint on the merry-go-round had flaked into dull patches. Yet standing there, Ethan felt a pull. He remembered another forgotten playground from his boyhood in Clay County, how he had stared at it from across the field, wishing he had a place to run where the grass didn't stain his only pair of jeans. Now, in the silence of twilight, the abandoned swings whispered like ghosts. What if we had been kept alive? What if children had filled us with laughter instead of dust? The next morning, he returned with a toolbox. It was nothing fancy, just the same kit he had carried through years of minor home repairs. But in his hands, it felt heavier, like a chance to rebuild more than metal and wood. He started small, tightening bolts on the swing set, sanding the jagged edge of the slide. His movements were clumsy at first. He had once managed billions with a flick of his pen, but here, every screw demanded patience, every board required care. Sweat rolled down his back, and for the first time in years, he welcomed it. "What you doing?" The voice came from behind the fence. Sophie's braid bobbed as she pressed her face to the links. "Trying to fix something," Ethan said, wiping his forehead. Her eyes widened. "This place used to be magic. But Mom said it was too broken." She squeezed through a gap in the fence before he could stop her. "Can I help?" He hesitated. "Tools aren't toys." "I can hand them to you," she countered. And just like that, she became his apprentice, lining up screws like treasure, holding the flashlight steady, humming tunes while he hammered. By afternoon, 2 more children appeared, curious. One brought a can of leftover paint. Another carried chalk. Soon, the cracked pavement was alive with drawings, flowers, rockets, crooked rainbows. Rachel arrived at dusk, arms crossed, watching from the gate. Her face held that careful mix of skepticism and wonder. She hadn't invited him into her world. Sophie had. And yet here he was, kneeling in the dirt, his blazer tossed aside, his hands raw but steady. "She trusts you," Rachel said quietly, when Sophie ran to fetch more nails. Ethan looked up, startled by the weight in her tone. "She shouldn't. I'm not—" "You're here," Rachel interrupted. "Sometimes that's enough." Her words hung between them, fragile but firm. By the end of the week, the playground had begun to change. The slide gleamed under a new coat of paint. The swings held strong against Sophie's eager kicks. Benches stood straight again, and laughter, thin, uncertain at first, returned to the air. But not everyone welcomed it. On the third evening, Ethan overheard two neighbors at the fence. "Look at him," one muttered. "Wall Street crook trying to polish his image." "Exactly," the other replied. "Probably wants the cameras back on him. You'll see, this is just a show." Their words pierced sharper than nails. Ethan kept working, but his chest tightened. No matter what he built, people still saw rubble. That night, as he walked home, Sophie skipped beside him, oblivious to the whispers. "The playground feels alive again," she said. "It was waiting for someone." "For someone better than me," he murmured. She shook her head so hard her braid came loose. "No. It was waiting for you." At Maple Street, Rachel lingered at the door, studying him. "You don't have to fix the whole town to matter," she said softly. "Sometimes it's enough to fix one swing." Ethan looked past her shoulder into the small apartment, the patched couch, the fridge photo, the crayon suns taped to the wall, and he wondered, not for the first time, if the real playground he was repairing wasn't made of bolts and boards, but of trust. Still, as he lay awake later in his empty apartment, the neighbors' voices replayed in his head. Fake, show, crook. He gripped Sophie's drawing in his pocket until the paper nearly tore. The playground was coming alive, but so were the ghosts of doubt. Ethan was crouched by the slide, tightening a final bolt, when a voice called from the edge of the playground. Smooth, confident, almost theatrical. "Well, well, Ethan Cole, trading a suit for a wrench. I never thought I'd live to see it." Ethan froze. He knew the voice before he lifted his head. Standing by the crooked fence was Victor Hale, immaculate in a tailored coat, hair slicked back, smile carved sharp as a blade. The man hadn't changed much. Time had only polished him, while it had weathered Ethan down. "What are you doing here, Victor?" Ethan's voice was flat, but his stomach twisted. Victor stepped closer, brushing dust from the bench with a handkerchief before sitting. "Business took me south. Imagine my surprise when I heard whispers that the great Ethan Cole was hammering swings for charity." He laughed softly. "Tell me, what's the end game? A photo op? A redemption tour?" "This isn't about that," Ethan muttered, tightening the bolt until the wrench squeaked. "Then what is it?" Victor leaned forward. "You don't belong here. You were made for skyscrapers, for boardrooms, for numbers that bend the world. Not this." He gestured around at the half-painted merry-go-round. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. "Maybe I don't belong anywhere anymore." Victor's eyes gleamed. "Nonsense. You belong with me. I have a new firm. We're expanding into crypto, biotech, the works. Big money, Ethan. And I could use you. Imagine it. The comeback headline, Cole and Hale together again." The words clawed at him. Once he would have leapt. The rush of deals, the language of billions, it had been his bloodstream. But he also remembered the night it all collapsed. The scandal that bore his name while Victor slipped away untouched. You used me, Ethan said quietly. You left me to burn. Victor's smile didn't falter. Collateral damage. You know how the game is played. And here you are, covered in rust and dirt, while I'm still at the table. Think about it. He left a business card on the bench, crisp and heavy, embossed with gold lettering. Then he rose and walked away, the scent of expensive cologne lingering like a taunt. Rachel had been standing nearby, arms folded. She walked over slowly. Old friend? Old ghost, Ethan replied. He picked up the card, stared at it until the letters blurred. Rachel's gaze was steady. You looked tempted. I was, he admitted, the words bitter on his tongue. For a second I wanted it all back. The power, the respect. And? She pressed. He slipped the card into his pocket, then pulled it back out and set it on the ground. And then I remembered what came with it. He crushed the corner under his boot. That night, though, the temptation gnawed at him. He lay awake in his barren apartment, imagining skyscrapers instead of cracked walls, handshakes instead of silence. The next morning, Sophie found him sitting on a bench by the playground, eyes distant. She climbed up beside him, clutching something in her hand. You look heavy, she said. He tried to smile. Just tired thoughts. Without another word, she pressed a small purple stone into his palm. It was smooth, with the word helper written in uneven marker. I made it for you, she explained. So when you forget, you'll remember. Ethan turned the stone over, his throat tight. Remember what? That you're not supposed to leave people behind, she said matter-of-factly. Not even yourself. He closed his fingers around the stone, the coolness grounding him. For years he had carried only the weight of failure. Now, in his pocket, he carried a child's faith. Rachel watched from a distance, her expression unreadable. She didn't know if Ethan would stay or if Victor's shadow would still pull him away. But in that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected. Ethan holding a stone as if it mattered more than any fortune he had ever signed into existence. The playground still needed paint. The benches still wobbled. But for the first time, Ethan felt steadier than the ground beneath his feet. Ethan stopped in his tracks. The wall he had painted with care now screamed at him in angry red letters. Spray paint dripped down like blood, a public scar for everyone to see. The toolbox in his hand trembled. Sophie was the first to arrive. She stared at the words and then at him. Her small hand slid into his. If they don't see you, she whispered, I will. Rachel came next, her eyes shadowed from another night shift. She looked at the wall, then at Ethan's face. This is what people do when they're afraid of change, she said quietly. They try to break it before it grows. Neighbors began to gather outside the fence. Whispers turned sharp. See? He just wants attention. Told you it was all an act. The weight of shame pressed hard. For a moment, Ethan thought of walking away, letting the weeds take the playground back. It would be easier to vanish than to stand in the storm again. But Sophie held tighter. Don't go. Please. The words anchored him. He dropped to his knees and began scrubbing the paint, though it only smeared. His hands turned red, his throat burned with defeat. Then Mr. Jenkins, the old man from the neighborhood, stepped forward. Got any primer? He asked. Soon, more hands appeared. Rollers, brushes, even donuts passed around to keep energy alive. The crowd that had come to gawk began to work. Layer by layer, the insult disappeared. When the wall stood blank again, silence fell. Everyone waited. Leave it empty, or answer back. Ethan's fingers found the purple stone in his pocket. He looked at Sophie, then spoke. Truth outlives noise. The words landed like a nail set firm. Rachel picked up a brush, Sophie dotted the I with a star, and together the town painted the new message across the wall in blue. By evening, the playground felt different. Not perfect, but alive. Children laughed again, chalk flowers bloomed on the pavement, and the swings groaned with joy instead of loneliness. Ethan sat on the bench, the purple stone warm in his hand. For the first time since his fall, he believed the wound on the wall was no longer his alone to carry. But deep down, he knew, wounds invite storms, and this one was only the beginning. Her name was Clara Jennings. She wasn't from the glossy magazines that had once paraded Ethan's rise or shredded his fall. She was independent, carrying only a notebook, a camera too old for flash, and a way of listening that made silence feel less heavy. Clara found him at the playground one afternoon, bent over the last coat of paint. She didn't barge in, didn't shove a microphone. She simply stood at the fence until he noticed. "You're Ethan Cole," she said, voice calm. He wiped his brow. "I was." "I'd like to write," she continued. "Not about Wall Street, about this, about what you're doing here." "No," Ethan said quickly. His answer was sharp, born of scars. "I don't need saving by headlines." Clara didn't argue. She closed her notebook and leaned on the fence. "Then I'll watch. Not for them, for me." For days she came and went, jotting notes, photographing chipped benches and children's chalk drawings instead of Ethan's face. She spoke to neighbors, to Rachel, even to Sophie, who proudly showed her the purple stone and the motto on the wall, "Truth outlives noise." Ethan avoided her gaze, but sometimes, when the day grew quiet, he caught himself wondering what she was seeing. Not the disgraced financier, not the man humiliated in a grocery line. Something else. Something even he wasn't sure existed anymore. At night, conversations with Rachel grew longer. They stood by the gate after Sophie fell asleep, talking in low voices. Rachel told him of the exhaustion of hospital halls, the ache of losing Tom, the weight of raising a child in a world that never stops taking. Ethan told her pieces of his past he had never shared, how the boardroom had felt like oxygen until it turned toxic, how betrayal had stripped not only his name, but his belief that people could be trusted. "You can trust Sophie," Rachel said softly one evening. "I already do," Ethan admitted, and the truth of it startled him. For the first time in years, Ethan began to think healing might not be a fantasy. The playground was coming alive, laughter was returning. Even Rachel's guarded eyes seemed to soften. But ghosts do not vanish without a fight. Late one Friday, a video began to circulate online. Grainy, dark, stitched together from security footage and shaky clips. It showed Ethan standing by the wall on the morning of the vandalism, rag in hand, paint smeared red across his palms. The edit was brutal, cutting away context, layering whispers. The caption read, "Caught. Ethan Cole staged the attack for sympathy." By dawn, the whispers outside the playground were no longer background noise. They were sharp, accusatory. He wanted attention. Fake savior after all. Even the wall was his lie. Ethan stood before the gate as neighbors gathered. His throat ached with words he could not shape. Sophie tugged his sleeve, her small face pale. Rachel stood at his side, eyes blazing, but her silence could not hold back the tide. Clara appeared then, notebook in hand. "It's doctored," she said firmly. "The timestamps are cut, the frames manipulated. I can prove it." But proof takes time, and rumors move faster. The weight pressed down, heavier than any scandal he had endured before, because this time he had something to lose. Trust. That night, Ethan sat alone on the bench, the purple stone digging into his palm. He wanted to throw it, to let the shadows swallow him whole. But then Sophie's voice returned in memory. "If they don't see you, I will." He closed his fist around the stone and whispered into the silence, "Please, let that be enough." A crowd gathered under the blue letters on the wall. The sentence, "Truth outlives noise," seemed suddenly fragile, like it might peel away with the next gust of wind. Neighbors who once brought paint trays now crossed their arms. Eyes narrowed. The video had spread too quickly, its jagged edits convincing enough for doubt to sink roots. People muttered in clusters. He smeared the wall himself. All a trick for sympathy. Knew it was too good to be true. Ethan stood before them, the purple stone heavy in his pocket. For a moment, he considered silence, just walking away, letting the town keep its suspicion. But Sophie's hand slipped into his. "Don't hide," she whispered. Rachel stepped up beside them, her nurse's scrubs still marked from the shift she had just finished. Her voice cut through the murmurs. "That night, he wasn't here. He was with me, with my daughter. I saw him. I know where he was." The crowd shifted uneasily. Witnesses mattered, but doubt had a longer reach than trust. Clara Jennings pushed forward, notebook tucked under her arm. Her voice was steady, professional, but carried the weight of someone who had chosen truth over spectacle. "The video is doctored," she declared. "I've reviewed the raw footage. Timestamps overlap. Shadows don't match." It was spliced together to make him look guilty. "Why should we believe you?" someone called. "Because I didn't come here for clicks," Clara answered. She held up still frames, printed and highlighted. "Look closely. The wall already had the paint when he arrived. The smear on his hands came from trying to clean it, not create it." The murmurs faltered. People leaned in. Doubt cracked just slightly. Then Mr. Jenkins, the old man with the steady gaze, raised his hand. "I don't need timestamps. I believe the girl." He nodded at Sophie. "She stood by him when nobody else would. I trust her eyes more than any video." Silence followed, heavier than all the noise before. One by one, heads turned toward Sophie. Her small shoulders straightened. She looked at Ethan, then at the crowd. "He didn't lie," she said firmly. "He was fixing the swing with me. If you don't believe him, believe me." Her voice carried more than proof. It carried innocence that hadn't learned to bend. Something in the crowd softened. Arms unfolded, murmurs quieted. Rachel placed a hand on Ethan's arm. Clara lowered her notebook, her job momentarily replaced by conviction. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low but steady. "I've lied before. I've failed before. But not here. Not to her. Not to this place. If you'll let me, I'll keep building. If not," he spread his hands, "then I'll walk away. But I won't stage lies to buy back what I lost." For a long moment, no one moved. Then a woman stepped forward with a bucket of nails. "The benches still wobble," she said. "Let's finish what we started." Relief cracked through the air like sunlight through storm clouds. Others nodded, some sheepishly, some still cautious. The trial was not a complete acquittal, but it was enough to keep the work alive. As the crowd dispersed, Sophie tugged Ethan down to her level. "See?" she whispered. "Truth outlives noise." Ethan closed his fist around the purple stone and breathed for the first time that day. He knew storms would return, but tonight the community had chosen to stand, not because the noise had ended, but because truth had spoken louder. It stood on a corner of Maple Street, windows cracked, vines crawling across bricks, dust sealing its doors like a forgotten tomb. The old town library, once a place of stories, now a shell of cobwebs and echoes. After the storm of rumors, after the trial in the playground, it was here that the town gathered. "This could be more than a ruin," Clara said, standing in the doorway with her notebook shut for once. "It could be a hearth." Rachel folded her arms, studying the sagging roof. "A hearth takes work." Ethan looked up at the faded letters etched in stone. Maple Community Library. His chest tightened. He had lost skyscrapers, headlines, fortunes. But this broken shell, looked more like a second chance. "Then let's work," he said simply. And so they did. Every day after shifts, people trickled in. Carpenters with hammers, teenagers with brushes, mothers with cleaning cloths. The dust lifted in clouds, then in rays of light. Shelves that once bent under forgotten encyclopedias were repaired. Floors were scrubbed until wood grain shone again. Ethan carried planks, hammered nails, patched leaks. His hands blistered and bled, but he didn't hide them. For once, his labor was not a performance, not a transaction. It was presence. Sophie was everywhere. She swept corners, drew chalk hearts on the floor before the rugs covered them, and ran around whispering, "It's ours. It's everyone's." Rachel helped too, balancing exhaustion from the hospital with the stubborn joy of creating something lasting. She saw Ethan bent beneath beams, shoulders straining, face dirt-streaked, and realized he was no longer running from his past. He was anchoring himself in something larger. Clara stayed as well. At first she took notes, intending to write, but slowly the notebook closed more often than it opened. She traded her pen for a paint roller, her camera for a broom. "I came to tell the story," she admitted one evening as she stacked books onto cleaned shelves. "But I think I'd rather live it." The idea for the name came from Sophie. She stood in the middle of the dusty hall and announced it with the certainty of someone declaring the sun would rise. "We'll call it Helper's Corner. Because helpers belong here." The name stuck. No one argued. It was right. Weeks passed. The smell of fresh paint replaced mildew. Children's voices returned, reading out loud, laughing in corners. Elders brought chairs and began telling stories in evening circles. The space grew warm not because of heat, but because of use. Finally came the day of the opening. The town gathered beneath strings of paper lanterns hung across the entrance. Inside, the shelves gleamed, lined with donated books. A corner overflowed with board games and puzzles. Another corner held a carpet where toddlers crawled. Rachel stood near the doorway, holding back tears she didn't want anyone to see. Clara smiled as she arranged the last of the flyers. Helper's Corner. A place for everyone. Mr. Jenkins placed his cap over his heart as he took a seat up front. Then Sophie walked to the small podium set up in the middle of the room. She looked out at faces, old, young, weary, hopeful. In her hands she held the purple stone. "This was for Mr. Ethan," she said, voice steady. "I gave it to him so he wouldn't forget he's a helper. But helpers don't keep things for themselves. They give them back." She turned and placed the stone in Ethan's hands again, this time in front of everyone. "Now it belongs here," she said softly. Ethan's throat closed. He had stood before stockholders, before cameras, before judges. But never had his knees felt so weak. He lifted the stone, then set it gently in the corner of the rebuilt library, beneath a small plaque hastily carved from wood. Helper's Corner. The room erupted in applause. Not loud, not frenzied, but steady, like rain after drought. Ethan bowed his head, tears breaking free at last. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from ghosts or fighting to prove himself. He was simply home. Inside a story not written by headlines, but by hands that had built something together. The years had not been easy, but they had been true. Helper's Corner had grown from a dusty ruin into the beating heart of the neighborhood. Children carried their school bags straight through its doors after classes. Old men played chess in the back room, their laughter echoing off the bookshelves. Nurses came on breaks, setting down tired feet to drink tea among the shelves. No one called Ethan Cole the Wall Street Man anymore. He was simply Ethan, the one who fixed broken swings, who patched leaky roofs, who sat down to listen when words stuck in someone's throat. Rachel was still at the hospital, her hair silvered but her step steady. She called Helper's Corner her second ward, a place that healed in ways medicine never could. Clara Jennings, once a reporter, had never left town. She kept her notebook in a drawer, saying she didn't need to write the story because she was too busy living it. And Sophie, no longer the gap-toothed girl who handed over coins in a supermarket, stood tall at the front of the library, now a young woman. She held a folded paper in her hand, her voice trembling only at the first word. 10 years ago. I gave a stranger my pocket money, she began. The crowd chuckled softly. I thought it was just to help him buy groceries, but what he gave back was bigger. He gave us this. She gestured around, the shelves lined with books, the mural on the wall, the circle of chairs filled with neighbors. Helper's Corner isn't just a building. It's proof that truth really does outlive noise. She paused, unfolding the old drawing she had once scribbled in crayon. A tall stick figure surrounded by small hands, the words, "Stand next to," written in block letters. The paper was faded, but the message was clear. I drew this for him when I was 8. Today, I want to give it back, not to him alone, but to all of us, because it's our rule now. The audience rose in quiet applause. Tears shone in more than one pair of eyes. Ethan sat near the front, his hands trembling on the cane he had started using. His face was lined, but his eyes were steady, bright. He looked at Sophie and saw not the little girl who had saved him in a checkout line, but a woman carrying light forward. Slowly, he stood. The room hushed. He walked to the corner of the library, where a small wooden plaque still bore the name Helper's Corner. Beneath it, resting inside a glass case, was the purple stone Sophie had once pressed into his palm. Ethan opened the case with careful hands. He lifted the stone one last time, its surface smooth with years of touch. Then he set it down again, not in his pocket but at the base of the plaque. For the next generation, he whispered, his voice breaking. Rachel moved closer, slipping her arm around his. You did it, she said quietly. He shook his head. We did it. She did it. His eyes rested on Sophie, who was smiling through tears. Outside, the mountains stood unchanged, their roots deep, their peaks steady against the horizon. Ethan thought of the man he had once been, chasing headlines, terrified of silence. Now, standing in the library filled with life, he understood. Roots mattered more than headlines. The applause swelled again, but Ethan barely heard it. He was looking at the faces, neighbors, friends, children grown tall, Rachel, Sophie, even Clara leaning against the doorway. Faces that had once been strangers, but were now family. He sat back down, tears on his cheeks, a smile softening his face. Finally, he murmured, I am home. And the stone glowed quietly in its corner, carrying the weight of a truth that would never be erased.